Hello again, this is Rich Troxler, aka Rich Trox, and welcome to part B of my video, Gear, Knots, Rigs, and Other Useful Stuff. In part A, I discussed rods and reels in detail, and in part B, I'll be discussing fishing lines and leaders, terminal tackle, and knots and rigs. I'll start by saying that where catching fish is concerned, you are only as strong as the weakest link in the chain. So don't skimp on stuff like fishing line, swivels, and hooks. When that fish of a lifetime comes along, you'll want a picture instead of a story about the one that got away. So now that you know about rods and reels, let's take a look at what kind of line to put on them. A quick history of modern fishing lines is that in the very early 1900s, fishing lines were woven from silk or linen. Then in the 1950s, braided polyester was developed and marketed as Dacron line. This was followed by nylon monofilament line, known today by its contracted name, mono. And then somewhere around 1990, lines made from multi-fibered polyethylene called Spectra or Dyneema started to pop up in tackle stores. These are known today as simply braided line. Around that same time frame, fluorocarbon leaders and fishing line also became available, as well as copolymers, which are basically monoline coated in fluorocarbon or another nylon polymer. Here's a quick look at some of the characteristics of each type line before looking into their pros and cons. Nobody markets or uses linen or silk lines anymore, so we'll start with Dacron. Dacron fishing lines are still made today, but are not typically used for surf fishing. That said, I do know of one excellent surf fisherman who still uses Dacron line when fishing the many rock groins of Long Island and New Jersey. Braided Dacron lines are much thicker in diameter than the modern Spectra braids made today. They also do not have the slick coatings on them that the Spectra braids have, so they don't cast well with spinning gear and are used primarily on conventional reels only. And like all braids, they have little to no stretch to them. Monofilament line is a single strand of extruded nylon. It is one of the two most popular fishing lines used today. Monolines were the first fishing line developed that had relatively low visibility. They cast relatively well on both spinning and conventional gear. Monolines are fairly abrasion resistant and durable, but will rot over time when exposed to the elements. They also have memory, meaning they hold the shape of the spool that they are wound onto. And lastly, monolines stretch quite a bit when pressure is applied to them. Braided Spectra lines are the other most popular fishing line used today, and they are a bit of a different animal than mono. Braided lines are much thinner in diameter than equivalent pound test mono lines, and most have a slick coating on them that allow them to cast well with both spinning gear and conventional gear. Like mono, braided lines are also fairly abrasion resistant, but not quite as much as equivalent pound test mono lines. But unlike mono, they are very rot resistant and last much longer than mono and have very low memory. And lastly, they have virtually no stretch to them. Fluorocarbon lines are made from polyvinylidene difluoride, extruded in a single strand just like mono. Their main claim to fame is that they have the same refractive index as water, which means they are almost invisible in water. Fluorocarbon lines are denser, stiffer, and heavier than their mono counterpart. They are also more abrasion resistant and have less stretch than mono lines. And lastly, copolymer lines try to mix the best characteristics of nylon monofilament and fluorocarbon lines together to produce a line that is less stiff than fluorocarbon, but retains the low visibility and lower stretch of fluorocarbon lines. So what line should you use? Well, there are pros and cons to all lines, and many line characteristics can either be a pro or a con depending upon what type of fishing you will use it for. This makes it difficult to present them in a black and white fashion, so I'm just going to wing it. Let's start at the top with Dacron. A definite con of Dacron is that it is designed to be used on conventional reels only. You can spool it on a spinning reel, but with its large diameter it won't cast very well. Another definite con is that Dacron lines are highly visible, so they must be used with a leader. Dacron has little to no stretch, and this can be a pro and a con. The pro vote is for setting a hook at the end of a long cast. Having no stretch means the movement of your fishing rod is transmitted immediately to the hook at the other end of the line, resulting in solid hook sets. The con to no stretch is that you have to be careful not to allow slack in the line while fighting a fish, particularly when landing big fish on an ocean beach. One moment of slack line is all it takes for the fish to throw the hook or have it simply drop out of the hole in its mouth. Lastly, Dacron has a larger diameter per test than the newer braided lines do. This too can be a pro or a con. The pro would be that the larger the diameter of the line, the more pressure moving water applies to it. So when fishing inlets or channels, this allows you to fish larger swim shads or bucktails and still keep them from rolling around on the bottom. Conversely, the larger diameter can make it difficult to get a small profile down deep in moving water. Next up is monofilament line. A definite pro of monoline is that in its natural state it has low visibility, which means you don't necessarily need to use a leader with it. It is also available in high visibility colors for when tracking line movement of a hooked fish is important, as well as a wide variety of pound tests. Monolines cast well on both spinning and conventional gear. Out of all the line types, I'd say that monoline is probably the most abrasion resistant. I'll be testing this on a future video. One of the cons of monoline is that it does tend to rot fairly quickly when exposed to the sun and not washed off after use. Another con, and this is a big one, is that monoline has memory, so it has to be spooled on both spinning and conventional reels correctly, otherwise it springs off the spool and binds up in a knot. It also has a tendency to twist up over time when used on spinning reels. The last two characteristics can be both pros and cons. Monolines have a significantly larger diameter than equivalent pound test Spectra braids do, so the pro and con diameter scenarios used for Dacron line apply here also. But unlike Dacron, monoline has considerable stretch to it, which means it is harder to get a good hook set at the end of a long cast, but makes it less likely that a fish will spit the hook if your rod tip drops while fighting or landing a fish. Now let's check out braided Spectra lines. There's a lot of things to like about braided lines, and again, some can be considered pros and cons. As mentioned earlier, braided lines are much thinner in diameter than monolines of the same pound test. The positive in this is that the thinner diameter lines cast further on spinning gear. It also allows you to use heavier pound tests so you worry less about breaking the line under load. Braided lines are fairly abrasion resistant and do not rot out as fast as monolines do when exposed to the elements. They also have very little memory and little to no stretch to them, as well as excellent sensitivity, which allows you to feel bites and get better hook sets. These are all good things. But braided lines also have some drawbacks. Braided lines must be wound onto spools over mono backing, or else there is a chance that the braided line will slip on the spool when under load. And because of braided line's tendency to slip, only certain knots will work with braid. The thinner diameter of braids will also cut into the spool of line when under load, which can cause problems on the next cast, particularly with conventional gear. On spinning reels, braided lines are prone to wind knots, especially if you overfill the spool. On conventional gear, braided line must be spooled onto the reel in a specific manner, and if you throw a bird's nest with it, the reel is done for the night. And lastly, braided lines are expensive when compared to other lines. Lastly, we have fluorocarbon lines and copolymer lines. The two main pros are that fluorocarbon lines and copolymer lines coated in fluorocarbon are near invisible in water. This obviously means that line-shy fish can't see these lines. The second pro is that fluorocarbon lines are very abrasion resistant and have relatively low stretch as compared to monolines. The downside to these lines is that they tend to be stiff and difficult to handle, meaning the line tends to jump off spinning reel spools when the bail is open, or bird nest easily on conventional reels. The stiffness can also make them difficult to tie knots with. All fishing lines have their pros and cons, and what it comes down to is which line has the characteristics that fit the type of fishing you intend to do. All fishing lines have some sort of specifications on their spools, so that you know what it is that you are buying. Here's a list of the most common fishing line specifications. The first spec that most people look for is pound test. This is the rating for breaking strength. Breaking strength is the amount of pressure that must be applied to an unknotted line before the line breaks. The color of the line is also indicated somewhere on the label. Common colors for monolines are clear, blue, and pink. Common colors for braided lines are black, green, and white. Some high visibility colors like yellow and orange are also available for both mono and braided lines. The amount of line on the spool is shown somewhere on the label and is typically expressed in yards, but may also have the metric equivalent posted. As talked about in the Part A video, fishing reel specifications usually state how much of a particular pound test line it takes to fill the reel spool, so this is where this information comes in handy. The diameter of the line is also listed, usually somewhere near the spool yardage. Line diameter is expressed in decimals, but may also be shown in millimeters. It should be noted again that braided lines are much thinner in diameter than equivalent pound test mono lines, and this comparison is sometimes shown on the spools of some braided line brands. There may be other brand-specific information on the spools, but these specs I just covered are the most common. Now let's take a quick look at leaders. Where surf fishing is concerned, there are really only 3 leaders that are typically used. These are fluorocarbon, mono, and wire. We've already discussed the properties of fluorocarbon and mono lines, and those same properties apply to leader material also. Fluorocarbon leaders are basically invisible in water, and they are very abrasion resistant. These properties make them a good choice for those throwing plugs and artificials during the day, or for when fishing for line-shy species. The only real downside is that fluorocarbon leader material is more expensive than mono-leader material. I've always considered the extra expense as the cost of doing business. Like fluorocarbon leader material, mono-leader material is very abrasion resistant. It is also a little less stiff than fluorocarbon, so it is easier to tie knots in rigs with. It is an excellent choice for fishing bait on the bottom for fish species that aren't line shy. It is also less expensive than fluorocarbon, which makes it easier on the wallet. Wire leaders are best used when toothy critters are your target. There are many pre-made wire leaders available. Some of them are made of braided strands of wire for flexibility, and many of those are coated in nylon for smoothness. There are also straight steel wire leaders and steel leader material so that you can tie your own after a little practice with the haywire twist. But unless you specifically need wire leaders, your best options are to stick with either mono or fluorocarbon leader material for all of your leaders and rigs. Terminal tackle is the stuff that goes at the end of your line. There are lots of weird gimmicky rigs out there, but most of them are made to catch fishermen, not fish. The basic terminal tackle used in surf fishing includes hooks, various swivels and snaps, and sinkers. There are also specialty items like popping corks and whatnot, but I won't be discussing their use in this video. The very last item attached to your fishing line is the hook. Its function should need no explanation. While there are many variations on fish hook design, most hooks used for surf fishing fall into 2 categories, the J-hook and the circle hook. With J-hooks, you provide the power required for setting the hook into the fish's mouth. With circle hooks, the fish provides the power needed to set the hook into its own mouth. Why this works will be explained soon. Hook size is rated using numbers. You can think of 0 as the dividing point. The smaller size hooks use a number up to 32 to define their size. The odd thing here is that the larger the number, the smaller the hook size. On the other side of 0 are the larger hooks. These hooks have a /0, also called aught, and these hooks get larger as the number increases up to 20. For most all of the surf fishing you are likely to do, the hook sizes will range from 1/0 to 12/0. Hook anatomy is pretty basic. The line or leader attaches to the hook eye. Hooks have either a straight eye or an offset eye. Line connection to hooks with offset eyes is usually done by snelling, which will be demonstrated later in this video. For hooks with straight eyes, you tie direct with something like a Palomar knot, which will also be demonstrated later in this video. The rest of the parts of the hook are pretty straightforward. There's the shank, the bend, the barb, the point, and the gap. The main difference between J-hook design and circle hook design is that on circle hooks, the bend is larger and rounder, and the gap between the point and the shank is wider. Also, the point is bent inward toward the shank. The theory behind this is that as the fish swims away with the bait and starts to swallow the bait, the bent point will prevent gut hooking the fish. Then when pressure is applied, the hook moves from the fish's throat back into its mouth, and when it starts to pull out of its mouth, the larger bend and wider gap will wrap around the fish's jaw, and the bent point will stick to the inside of the jaw. In practice, when using J-hooks, You set the hook hard and fairly quickly after the fish has picked up the bait. If you wait too long to set the hook, the fish will most likely be gut hooked. When using circle hooks, just allow the line to come tight and then apply some pressure and start reeling the fish in. I strongly recommend circle hooks for catch and release bait fishing. Let's take a look at a few of the basic terminal tackle items you'll need to go along with those hooks. Most every type fishing you'll be doing in the surf will require some sort of swivel, typically the basic barrel type swivel. When fishing plugs and artificials, a barrel swivel between your leader and running line prevents line twist from building up on the running line. Barrel swivels are also used on many hook rigs used for bait fishing. Not only do they prevent line twist on the running line, they also serve as a stop point for other terminal items such as on a fish finder rig. A fish finder rig is a widely used bait rig. The fish finder is basically a tube with a clip for attaching a sinker. The running line goes through the tube and attaches to the barrel swivel of the hook rig. A sinker is attached to the clip. This rig allows a fish to pick up the bait and run with it without feeling any resistance from the sinker. Sometimes a bead is added between the fish finder and the barrel swivel to protect the knot tied to the barrel swivel from the weight of the fish finder smacking into it on a cast. As for sinkers, there are basically three types you will wind up using in the surf. These are the bank type, pyramid, and Hatteras style sinkers. There are others, but these are the three most common. Bank sinkers are fine when there is little to no current, or you actually want your bait to roll along the bottom with the current. Pyramid sinkers do a much better job at keeping your bait in one place when current is present, this due to the flat sides. My personal favorite for most oceanfront fishing is the Hatteras style sinker, as I consider it the most stable. Lastly, when fishing plugs and artificials, there are only two ways to connect your plug. The first is to tie direct, either to the eye or to the split ring attached to the eye. The second is to use either a snap swivel or a fishing clip. Personally, I tie direct to everything I can, and I do not endorse the use of snap swivels at all. However, I do know a lot of fishermen who use the fishing clips from tactical anglers and are very happy with the way they perform. This is some of the basic terminal tackle you'll need to get you started fishing from the surf. For the last part of this video, I had intended to show you how to tie a few basic knots in rigs, the typical ones that are widely used, but couldn't really figure out how to effectively do this either through graphics or with my camera. I looked around on YouTube, and there are already about 1 million good videos on tying knots in rigs, so I'm just going to keep it simple and list the ones that I think are the most important. For tying direct to anything with an eye, such as a hook, a bucktail, or a swim shad, I always use a Palomar knot. I also use the Palomar knot for connecting the barrel swivel to my leaders and my running line. The Palomar knot has 100% breaking strength and is one of the approved knots for use with braided lines. For tying my leader direct to a plug, I use the improved clinch knot. This knot works well with mono and fluorocarbon, but will slip if used with braided line. A dropper loop is a useful knot to learn to tie. This knot allows you to add hooks, either raw or pre-tied, anywhere along your line or leader. Another simple knot that goes hand in hand with the dropper loop is either the single or double overhand knot. This knot is typically used to create a loop at the end of your line for hanging a sinker or bucktail. My friend John Skinner gives a nice presentation of both the dropper loop and the double overhand loop on his Skinner Fluke Rig video, which should be easy enough to find on YouTube. The uni-to-uni connection knot is essential to learn if you plan to use braided line, because you will need it to join the braided line to the mono backing. Some braided line manufacturers include a diagram of this knot in the product packaging. Lastly, learning to snell hooks is not a necessity, but it will allow you to make a lot of your own rigs. These knots I've mentioned are just a few of many that are useful, but with these you can get a long way down the road on your surf fishing journey. I hope you find this information helpful in getting you started, and don't forget to enjoy the ride. That's my view from the beach, so until next time, be well and catch 'em up.